And welcome to Wonderland. We just realized, I think today, that this is our 6-month anniversary this week. So, feels like it's brand new, and also that we've been doing this forever. But we're so thrilled to have you here. Just a couple of programming notes. We do have our events calendar up here if you want to take it with you. Books are for sale. I didn't ask, but will you sign?
I'd be happy to, of course.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So we are so thrilled to have Sebastian here with us today. So Sebastian Smee is a Pulitzer Prize-winning art critic, currently of the Washington Post, author of several books, most recently the one we're going to be focusing on tonight, Paris in Ruins, Love, War, and the Birth of Impressionism. He worked at the Boston Globe from 2008 to 2016 and previously worked in London and Sydney for the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The Spectator, the Sydney Morning Herald, and The Australian and The Monthly. He's joined tonight by Nora Krug, an editor and writer in Washington Post's Book World. She began at the Post writing a books column and later became co-editor of the weekly Health and Science section. Before joining the Post, she was an editor at the New York Times and Architectural Digest. Thank you both so much for coming. I can't wait to hear the discussion. Thank you all, and there will be a Q&A after you're finished with your Q&A.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. It's nice to see you. We are colleagues that rarely see each other because I'm here in Washington and he's in Boston. So this was actually our first time meeting in person. I loved your book. It came out in September, but it is what we call the post-book business. We say that it has legs, so it's still, out there being talked about, and excited to talk with you about it this evening. What you've done with this book is pretty complicated to pull off, weaving the stories of several painters such as Manet, Degas, and Morisot into the historical moment that helped shape them and that they helped shape. Can you make it look easy? I won't ask too much about how because it'll take too long, but so the other thing we're going to do, I don't know.
Hold it this way.
If you read Sebastian's work, which I hope that you do, he does something for the Post called Great Works in Focus, where he takes individual paintings and he brings you behind the scenes and looks closely, takes you far out. So I sprung it upon him today that we're going to be doing a little bit of that with some of the paintings that he discusses in the book.
I think that's great.
Okay. All right. But just to start at the top, so the period that you are focused on is France in 1870 and 1871, which was a tumultuous time politically and culturally, and yet one result is some of the most important and memorable works of art, and so some of which we're going to be looking at shortly. So I just was wondering if you could tell us briefly about this period in France and why you chose it, and why you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nora. And firstly, I just want to say I'm so happy to be here. I'm really grateful to you all for coming out, and congrats to Amy, and this is such a fantastic bookstore, so it's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you especially to Nora, because preparing to interview an author of this unnecessarily long book, I know you've done it many times before, but it's a lot of work, and I'm super grateful, especially when you're laminating pictures with your own private laminate. So anyway, this period and the art from this period, obviously, everyone knows at least some of the art from this period, and many of you here, of course, will have seen the show at the National Gallery, which was all about the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, and that was kind of coincidental timing for me. I was supposed to have this book in probably 2 years earlier than I did, but it worked out really nicely, and I was excited to see that show myself. And I've just been interested in the idea of what the effect of historical events, and I mean particularly traumatic, difficult historical events, may or may not have on art, and we can talk about that. I don't think it's ever a simple question. There's rarely a sort of direct line that you can draw. But when you understand just how bad things got, in the case of France in 1870 and 71, the Franco-Prussian War, the siege of Paris, and the Commune, you have to imagine that these famous artists who were involved and who lived through that must have been affected. And it's an interesting fact that a lot of the Impressionists didn't actually live through it. Monet and Pissarro were in London, Cézanne was in the south of France. But Manet, who's often referred to as the father of the Impressionists, lived through the siege of Paris, which again we can talk about. And so did Berthe Morisot. And so did Degas. My book really focuses on Manet and Morisot. I've always been intrigued by their relationship. And so Degas is really a sort of just a bit player, a tangential figure, but of course a great artist. And I just wanted to ask, how did these events affect these two artists, and how did the dynamic of their own personal relationship play?
You're going to have to stand.
So, in a sense, that's for me what the book is about. It hinges on the relationship and on these two artists and the art that they produced. But I try to set that in the historical setting of these really dramatic events.
As I was going to say, I confess that I generally work in fiction, and it seems like there's a bit of a historical romance novel sort of in the middle of this book. So I was wondering, you didn't really portray it that way, but if you could tell us a bit more.
I wanted to.
I'll have to talk to your editor. I talk about the relationship between the families of Manet and Morisot and how they became unusually intertwined from the beginning.
Yeah,
how it played out. We can talk about the art part of it.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, they were unusually intertwined. It's interesting. They were both, the Morisot family and the Manet family were both, pretty affluent families, well educated. They weren't, ridiculously rich, but they were well off, and in that way, quite different to most of the other Impressionists. And there were 3 sons in the Manet family, and there were 3 daughters in the Morisot family. 2 of the daughters, Berthe Morisot and her sister Edma, were wonderful artists, and their mother gave them, organized lessons for them with a series of really important artists, and one of those was Camille Corot, for instance, a great painter. And they both sisters had works that appeared in the annual Paris Salon, the great showcase for art held every year in Paris, where all the press came and the collectors and so forth. So they were doing very well, but Edma got married and had children, and did what in some ways at that time was expected of a woman of her background, even though she was a talented artist, many said even more talented than Berthe. She basically gave up her art, and they moved out of Paris. Her husband was a naval officer, so they lived on the coast, and she looked after the kids. But as a result of that, we have this amazing correspondence between Berthe Morisot and her sister Edma, which was one of the main sources for this book. And in the early days of Berthe having met Edouard Manet, they met in the galleries of the Louvre. She wrote a lot of letters to Edma talking about, her complicated feelings for Manet. The problem that made these feelings especially complicated was that he was already married. But there clearly seems to have been, an infatuation or a deeper love it may have turned into. I remember talking with Adam Gopnik, the writer, about, he knows a lot about this period and about these artists, and I said, it's frustrating, there's no, I didn't say smoking gun, but you know what I mean, there's no evidence that they actually had an affair, but there's so much feeling in the letters and in what other people said about them and so forth. And I said, so I don't know if they had an affair, and he said, really? You don't think they had an affair? And yet it was difficult because, you have to stick to the facts. And I did consider trying to turn this into a novel, but I'm sure I would have made a mess of that. So I tried to just stick to what I knew and could prove. But because I'm interested in the psychology, of artists. I think there is a bit of speculation in there as well. I'm completely, I hope, transparent about the moments where I am saying this may have happened or that may have happened or she may have been thinking this, and I try to sort of underplay that. But that was where my interest lay, in a sense. So yeah, there is that dimension to it, a frustrated romance novel.
And then the way it turned out is that she ended up with.
That's what I was supposed to say.
Yes.
Sorry, I was crapping on too long.
Yeah.
So yeah, after the living through the siege of Paris and the Commune, and after a series of paintings that Manet did of Morisot, which I think of as one of the most extraordinary records of intimacy in the history of art, she ended up marrying not Manet because that wasn't possible, but his brother. And so she, their daughter carried the Manet name, Julie Manet. There's been a whole exhibition about her, in fact. She's a really interesting figure, and the whole network of the whole circle of writers and composers and musicians and artists that they were all a part of is so fascinating. But yes, that was the next best thing.
Was he the Fragonard was a grandfather, wasn't he?
Yeah, there's talk of Berthe Morisot being descended from Honoré Fragonard, the great 18th century painter, but there's actually, it's not clear that there's actual evidence for that. So I've read Morisot experts who debunk that. So yeah, but it's often mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Do you want to move to a couple of those paintings that you just?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right.
Sure.
I think you're either talking about this one.
Right. So, well, this is the very first depiction by Manet that includes Berthe Morisot. So he met her in the galleries of the Louvre, and she.
I can hold it.
Okay. She instantly.
I'll hold it this side.
I'm not even holding my microphone. Sorry. She instantly reminded him of the sort of Spanish figures that Goya painted, because he was a huge fan of all things Spanish, but especially the paintings of Velázquez and Goya. And so he had this idea immediately to paint a kind of homage to Goya's Majas on the Balcony, which has a similar sort of configuration to this painting. So this is a kind of homage, and it has Berthe Morisot seated there. She's the lower figure, and I think her looks, her dark hair and sort of slightly recessed eyes, reminded him of these Spanish figures from Goya's painting. So he proposed this idea of modeling for the painting. She agreed. It wasn't an easy thing, I think, for her to agree, because he was a kind of scandal-prone painter, and there was the possibility that her reputation could be affected as a single woman, aged at the time around 29, sitting for a painter like Manet. But the fact that she herself was a respected painter already, I think gave her a free pass. And so that was the very first depiction by Manet of her. Thank you.
That's okay. Do you want to go on to another one?
It's up to you. It's up to you.
Oh, this is
Right.
that's more so. Sorry.
Yeah,
I got ahead of myself.
That's okay. Go ahead. We can talk about that as well.
No, I was going to set that up by saying that, I really appreciated that the attention that you gave to her in this book. I don't think, she's gotten enough attention, and I wondered, if you could talk a bit about how she sort of was able to come out from behind both like the stereotypes and the problems of being a single woman, being in love with the painter, and then becoming a well-known painter on her own, like how that happened.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it was obviously fraught, and she obviously overcame a lot of difficulties. Look, there were many women artists who were successful, both at the Salon and there's a scholar in Boston at Harvard who I've been talking to over a couple of years. Paris Spies Guns is her name, and she's written an amazing book that actually looks at the inventories of female artists showing both at the Salon in Paris and the Royal Academy in London. And there are many years through the revolutionary period from around 1760 to 1830 where women make up as much as 20% of the artists showing. I think that fell off to some degree, she says, in the period we're talking about here around the 1870s. But there were women artists, and there were women that Morisot could look up to some degree, like the sculptor Marcello and others. But of course, at the same time, the levels of chauvinism, to use that old-fashioned word, and just so many things in society, at every level, were stacked against an ambitious female painter. So she had to deal with all of that, and then it was complicated, as you say, by the fact that she was never Manet's student. He did have a student, Eva Gonzalez, who also has work in the National Gallery. But she was, I think, too proud and too independent and too perhaps confident and stubborn, confident in her own ability to be his student. So there was this vexed relationship for a while. But what I really believe, and I try to sort of talk about this in the final stage of the book, is that, by the sort of mid-1870s, he's learning from her as much as she's learning from him. They're in a kind of dialogue that's going on, and you can trace it almost painting by painting. There's going to be an exhibition, by the way, in San Francisco later this year, all about just Manet and Morisot. So I'm sure I'm going to learn more about it as well. But she was, you're absolutely right. She's been an undervalued, underestimated painter for a long time. She's not as well known as any of the other Impressionists, Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, in this country, Mary Cassatt, and Cézanne. But it has been changing. I would say especially in the last 10, 20 years, there have been more exhibitions about her. Her works can be found in so many of the great museums, both in this country and in France, and really around the world. And the story that I sort of finish on in this book, I think is really telling, because after she died, and a little too young, it has to be said. It's sad, because you keep thinking if she'd lived a few more decades.
Remind us how she was in her 50s.
Yeah, I think she was in her 50s, I think, yeah. But she could easily have lived another few decades, of course. So she died, and the other Impressionists, Degas, Monet, and Renoir, got together quickly. In their grief, they decided to organize a kind of memorial exhibition to her. Yeah. And there's an amazing account of how over the few days where they were setting up the exhibition, they almost came to blows, because they were fighting over how best to show her work. They all regarded her as their equal, if not their better in some cases, and they really wanted to make sure that her work was shown to its best effect. And they had supported her and believed in her during her life as well. And it's almost after she died that her reputation fell off for a few decades. But I think that's changing.
Would you like to we can talk about the painting that I held up accidentally?
Yeah.
I have two in a row by her. So.
Great. Well, you might be familiar with this if you go to the National Gallery. This is is it called Two Sisters? I think it is.
It is.
Yeah. And it's just a gorgeous painting of her and Edma.
Can I pass it down?
Oh, yes.
Oh yeah, please. Yeah.
I think he knows it.
Yeah, I do. I think I can talk to it. But it's still in the early phase of her career. But I think it's her sort of testament to the really important role that her sister played in her life. And they went to these lessons together as teenage girls. They were sort of co-conspirators. They gave each other courage. They both showed at the annual salon, as I mentioned, and they kept speaking with each other after Edma got married and had children. And it's just one of those paintings that I think is a kind of a testament to a very close sisterly relationship.
Which they managed to maintain despite all the drama we just discussed.
That's right. I mean, they both were fascinated to have met these painters, not only Manet but Degas. They met around the same time. Degas is brought into this circle, and they're all going to each other's houses, to soirees at each other's houses, on a weekly basis. So I get the days mixed up in my head, but let's say it was Tuesdays at Degas' father's house, Wednesdays at Manet's mother's house, Thursdays at the Morisot's, Fridays at Alfred Steven's, and so, you know, and it was a circle of musicians, composers. You see many paintings that are of musical performances. Degas especially was really fascinated by the way people revealed their own, if you like, psychological state or emotional state when they were captured listening to music. I mean, if we all looked at you now, sort of watching and listening, and there was a portrait of all of you, you know, I mean, I think there are things that we reveal about each other when we're not. I've just made you conscious of yourselves, but when we're not so conscious of ourselves, and he was really fascinated by that, Degas, and so we get this amazing sort of picture of what the social life was like through portraits like the one you've just seen, and by Degas and by Manet as well. If you saw the Degas-Manet exhibition at the Met last year, was it last year? I think so. That really gave you a strong sense of the tight bonds in this circle, and the kinds of, you could almost imagine the kinds of conversations they were having about art, but also about music and other things.
At the time, you know, this type of painting was revolutionary. Now it doesn't seem that way. It seems, I don't know what word I'd use, standard, or
We're so familiar with it. Yeah.
Yes, familiar would be the word. So can you explain to us how it was revolutionary and why maybe it no longer seems so?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, through the 19th century and really for centuries before then, you know, that's such a broad, sweeping thing to say, but you know, obviously there were lots of advances in art and lots of changes. But you know, if you were being taught to paint conventionally in the mid-19th century, you would sort of, you would start with drawing, and you would learn to paint, you know, from dark leading up to sort of light highlights. So there was a, you know, when you go into the old master galleries, the paintings are just darker, aren't they? And everything would be painted in the studio, and there was a strict hierarchy of genres. So you would have, you know, history and religious painting, and then portraits, and then landscapes, and so on. And so, you know, it was all very rigid. And the Impressionists come along. There've been figures like Courbet, the realist, even before that Delacroix, you know, Romanticism. But they're all still painting in the studio, and they're you know, their brushstroke. I mean, Delacroix is an exception, but their brushstrokes are fairly tight. And if you're really taught to paint traditionally, you're going to conceal all evidence of the brushstroke. And then, you know, Manet comes along, and he says, all right, he loved Velázquez, he loved Goya. So he's loosening up his brushstrokes. He's painting tonally. So that's different from Impressionism at first, but he's certainly loosening up his brushstrokes in a whole new way. And then the gates, you know, the floodgates really open, and there's both a stylistic opening up where there's a sort of liberation of color, where you get, instead of this you know, painstaking building up from darks to lights, you get all the colors of the rainbow. But more importantly, they're painting outside, and they're responding to light, and the subject matter is contemporary. You know, Manet starts this, but Degas as well. They're starting to paint contemporary Parisian life. I mean, I'm repeating many things that you all already know, but you know, this really was a revolution. And at first, you know, most of the critics just couldn't abide it. They thought that this was,
I think this one.
right, Impressionist sunrise, exactly. You know, and it just seems almost unconscionably unfinished, sketchy. You know, almost an insult to the idea of art properly made after years of study, and, you know, carefully concealed brushstrokes and glazing and all the layers and so forth. So I'm rambling on, but it obviously was a revolution. But we all now, you know, Impressionism is pretty much the most popular movement. But I think it is important just to understand that there was a political dimension to this. And, you know, it's just striking that all of the Impressionists were Republicans, small r Republicans. That means that they believed in democracy. They were anti-Napoleon III, you know, whose government was a kind of authoritarian government. And so all this played into the events that I write about in the book. But, you know, when you think about this it's not just the stylistic change, but it's the embrace of contemporary Parisian life. It's this sense of like, we want to paint every class of Parisian society. We want to paint them working. We want to paint them on the weekends, enjoying their leisure time on the banks of the Seine. We want to put all the different classes into the one painting. You know, we want to show what a democratic society looks like. And I think it's that political dimension that we often forget about, because the pictures look so pretty. You know, there's sunlight and there's joy and there's pretty dresses, but there is this other dimension to it, and that's what I tried to get into a little bit in the book.
Did you get it all into the politics of the Dreyfus affair?
No, that comes a little bit. I was just asked about the Dreyfus affair. That comes just a little bit later, but certainly, you know, it divided the artists, who were involved in Impressionism, and it brought out a horrible sort of anti-Semitic strain in Degas, for instance. And so, yeah, but that's.
Did it affect Pissarro? Because
Pissarro was Jewish. He was a Sephardic Jew, and yes, it did affect him. And he had been very close friends with Degas, and it caused a falling out. But yeah, that's in a sense a different book, I would say. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about one that is a little bit more directly political.
Right.
So.
Right. So it's actually Manet, but you say Goya, but that's because you're very smart. And it's
not a quiz.
It's an homage to a Goya painting, and the story behind this, very briefly, it's called The Execution of Maximilian, or Execution of the Emperor Maximilian. It's set in Mexico. The story behind it is that Napoleon III, the aforementioned Emperor of France, whom Manet loathed, had helped install an imperial government in Mexico, sent French forces to Mexico, and the whole thing ended horribly when Mexican rebel forces ended up defeating that sort of puppet government, and Maximilian, the European emperor, was sort of left high and dry by Napoleon III. He withdrew his forces and left Maximilian there, and he ended up being executed. And they tried to suppress news of this back in France, but Manet knew about it, and so he painted not only this one picture, but actually 4 versions of it, 5 if you include a lithograph. And it was a very pointed political statement. It was clearly a critique of Napoleon III, and it did get censored. So it was a sort of a whole year of fruitless endeavor in a way, because it never really got showed publicly. The lithograph was suppressed, and what's that?
You want it back?
No, I'm just rambling on. But so yeah, that's what that painting's about. But it shows you, it's one of a few examples of paintings by Manet that really show you how politically engaged he was. And he had many friends in the Republican, small R Republican movement, including Leon Gambetta, who became a leading Republican, and plays a big part in the story.
To change gears a little bit, I wanted to ask, you talked about looking at letters, and I was just wondering what some of your primary sources on the book.
You know, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that it's not a deeply sort of, primary sourced book. Yes, I read the letters, and I a lot of the Morisot archive is in the Musée Marmottan in Paris. If you haven't been there, it's a wonderful museum. And so I was in correspondence with them. A lot of the main writing of the book took place during COVID, and so my dreams of spending months in Paris or years didn't eventuate. But I did live in Paris, when I was younger, with my wife, who had a job at the Winter Circus playing violin, funnily enough. So I know the city pretty well, and I did get to go over there sort of in the later stages of writing the book, and that induced me to make some changes. But so much of this material, because it is such a popular art movement, there's just so much great scholarship that really gets into the weeds of these artists, their works, their lives. There are great biographies of all these artists, and so I went to libraries. I lived with stacks of books, by my bed and all around my desk for many years. But there's not a huge amount of primary research.
I think everyone's going to want to ask you some questions soon, so I'm going to end on a happy, sad note, because this painting is one that is particularly interesting. It seems both happy and sad to me.
Yeah.
Tell us about this one.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's not quite as green as that in real life, but it's one of my favorite paintings by Berthe Morisot. She painted it on her honeymoon, which she spent in the UK. She went with Eugène Manet, who was Manet's brother, to the Isle of Wight, and then they went to London. And her letters, even from that period, are hilarious because there's this sort of, it was terrible weather, it got so hot, and they seemed to get annoyed with each other, at times. But it was also on other days happy and probably in many ways typical of a honeymoon. But this is a picture just of Eugène looking out the window from their hotel room in the Isle of Wight, and it's beautifully painted. Like the transparency of the curtains, I think, is done with tremendous subtlety and this gorgeous touch that she had. But there's also a slightly psychological dimension to it. I think there's a sense in which there's something claustrophobic going on, and you get a sense from him of a kind of, I don't know, you could project too much onto it, but he's sort of looking out almost longingly. There's maybe a certain frustration, maybe the pressure to be happy on one's honeymoon. A lot of things you could say about it, but it's just one of her most beautifully composed and I think psychologically rich paintings, and just the color and the brushwork is amazing. I think one of the things that made her really, really unique among the Impressionists is that she really opened up her brushwork. I keep using that phrase, but you know what I mean. She wasn't all meticulous in terms of finish. She wanted the direction and the velocity of her brushstrokes and the amount of paint that's loaded onto each brushstroke to do a lot of the work of expressing what she wanted to express. And as she develops in the 1870s and into the 1880s, she became really radical in that regard, and it gets to the point where she's leaving large areas of the canvas bare, and there are paintings that have these sort of looping lines that are almost more like Edvard Munch than any of the Impressionists. And so I really think that she was one of the most important painters of the 19th century, and understanding just how innovative she was, I think, is one of the things that I had a sense of before I wrote this book, but by really digging into it, I became more and more convinced of. So yeah, thank you for preparing these pictures. Seriously, it's really great.
I didn't realize how less green it actually is. But so I mean, I feel like there's
sure. If you want to have some questions, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
First of all, I love your book. It's a really wonderful book. And I had a question about dissonance that I felt in the book, not a critical of your writing, but critical of the situation. And that was, as you said, Manet was a follower of Goya, but when Napoleon had attacked Spain, Goya had gone through a dark period where he really portrayed the horrors of war in very graphic terms. And Manet almost was like escaping from it, as were some of the other paintings. So the street scenes of the real people, they were like the backs of people waiting on a bread line, It didn't show a single face. Or even the execution of the Commune Arts, it was mainly smoke. You didn't really see the real people, the real core. And so I just was curious. I felt that dissonance, and I just was wondering if you might have any thoughts about that.
I think that's such a great observation and a great question. It really is. I mean, one of the reasons that we all think about Goya when we think about art and war is, he was great, and his series of etchings, The Disasters of War, is one of the great, documents of human responses to atrocities and so forth. But we also focus on him so much because it's fairly unique in some ways to have artists responding so directly to war. I say that because one of the difficulties, I would like my book to have had more art in it, especially in the middle sections where I'm describing the political events, but they just didn't have the chance to make any work. I mean, Manet joined the National Guard, during the siege of Paris, and we haven't really got into this, but, the residents of Paris were reduced to starvation. The whole place was turned into a giant military barracks. The idea of getting out your easel and your canvas and your art supplies was just not on. I mean, it wasn't possible. Manet was as I say, in the National Guard, and he had to show up for duty, and be on guard pretty much every day. His role changed during the period, but it was very difficult to make art. But I agree, there is a kind of dissonance, and again, this gets to that question of, what is an artist's response to art? There's an infinite number of possibilities. I mean, you can go the Goya route, and you can respond with pictures of horrible things and make it as graphic as possible. Or you can maybe repress it and deny it. And you could say that the Impressionists in the 1870s wanted to just put it all behind them and show France coming back to life, leisure time and jobs and the economy booming again once it got going, because they didn't want to wallow in the humiliation that France had just gone through. So, it's a bit like, I always think it's a bit like the way we talk about, psychologically, responses to trauma. There are so many possibilities. There's repression and denial, there's projection, there's sublimation. I think it's a bit the same when we talk about artists' responses to socio-political events. It can take so many different forms. But such a great question. Thank you. Any other questions, please? Yes, sir.
I also enjoyed your book very much, and I learned a lot about French history. They really couldn't decide what sort of government they wanted, but in a brutal sort of way. But my question really is the relationship between Manet and Monet and Renoir and some of the younger Impressionists. I mean, what did they learn from him, and what was their relationship?
Well, they all looked up to Manet for sure, and Manet made a big impact at the Salon of 1861, where he painted a picture called The Spanish Singer. It's in the Met now, and we look at it and it doesn't look very impressionist, but it had a spirit that obviously showed off his love of Spain and the painting styles of Velázquez especially, but it just had a kind of life to it, and it more than anything attracted this kind of band of followers who all looked up to him. And then they all found him very charismatic, charming, great company, and they all sort of were in line with his politics. They didn't want France to be an authoritarian government. I mean, you're right, France had gone through a whole century of reversals, and I mean, you can't keep up. After the revolution, it's the terror, and then the constitutional, it's a series of changes of government, and in most cases those changes were very convulsive and violent. So no, they couldn't make up their mind. But by the time these artists come along, they're all aligned with Manet, and they're Republican, and so there's this natural sympathy between them. But yeah, Manet becomes more and more audacious, and they watch him through the 1860s trying out one more daring thing after another in terms of subject matter and stylistically. And he gets a terrible beating, really demoralizing. The response to Olympia, the famous nude of the model Victorine Laurent, and the response to the luncheon on the grass. They really almost defeated him. I mean, there are letters he writes to Baudelaire and to others where he's just so depressed and demoralized. But I think the fact that he kept going through all that and didn't stop, he didn't sort of back down, he kept on painting audacious pictures, I think that was a real inspiration to the other Impressionists. But Monet and Renoir really did take things to another level in terms of what we think of as Impressionism. But Morisot was right there with them, for sure. Degas and Manet are more sort of the urban Impressionists. They're painting the city and city life. The others are getting to the outskirts of Paris and painting the banks of the Seine and so forth. Yes, please.
I also enjoyed the book very much and learned quite a lot. My question has to do with why you think Manet discouraged Morisot from showing with the Société Anonyme after the siege, after the Commune. The tension still existed with the Salon, and Manet did not want her to break away from that and to show with these progressive artists. So it just seems so contradictory to his own experience, even though, as you say, he really got beaten up pretty badly. Do you think he was envious of her?
That's a good question. I had not thought of that aspect of it, but it's a really great question. Why? So the context is, and if you saw the show at the National Gallery, you'll know that show was really about two exhibitions that happened simultaneously in 1874. One was that year's Salon, where Manet showed, as he had been showing through most of the 1860s and into the 70s. The other was the first Impressionist exhibition. And so that's what, the show was essentially about, but it really was a tale of two exhibitions. And yes, the organizers of the Breakaway exhibition, which is something that this circle of artists had been talking about for at least half a decade, those artists banded together, and Degas was one of the organizers, and he invited Berthe Morisot to participate. They also invited Manet. Manet didn't want to, as you say. Berthe Morisot said, okay, I'll join. But Manet tried to discourage her. And during the sittings for those portraits that he did of her, they must have talked about it at great length. I think the two reasons he discouraged her, maybe apart from a little bit of jealousy, that's a really interesting thing to think about. But, there are two reasons. One is that he really still felt that to compete at the Salon was so important, because if you were going to be successful as an artist, you had to succeed there. That's where huge numbers of people came. That's where the critics came. And you have to remember, we talk about this other show as the first Impressionist exhibition, so a legendary exhibition, but at the time, it was just, it could have been nothing. It almost did sort of fizzle away. Very few people went to see it, almost nothing sold, and it had those famous artists, those now famous artists in it, but also a bunch of other painters, some of whom were, barely more than Sunday painters, as we might call them now. So he thought, look, he was saying to Berthe Morisot, it's not going to do you any favors to join in with this group. They're my friends, but don't do it. Just show at the Salon. That was his feeling. But on top of that, I think there was the fact that this breakaway group were going to get associated with the communards, the group of radicals who, a couple of months after the end of the siege, had staged a kind of insurrection, a coup, and taken over Paris. It lasted 3 to 4 months, and it ended in terrible bloodshed, a week of fighting that is still referred to as Bloody Week. And in the wake of that, there was an enormous backlash against people on the left, and especially people who'd been sympathetic to the communards. And these artists, who weren't communards themselves, but were sympathetic with their cause, ran the real risk of being associated with them. And people who were associated with the communards were getting shipped off to New Caledonia or put in prison, those who'd been lucky enough to survive the end of the commune. So it was really playing with fire, and Manet thought, this is not a good idea for you, when he spoke to Berthe Morisot, this is not a good idea for you to be associated with that. So it was complicated, but maybe a bit of jealousy was part of that as well, because Degas, with whom he had a vexed and sort of rivalrous relationship, was one of the organizers. So that may have played into it. I think that's a great point.
Yes.
Yes, please.
I understand you've written another book on the art of rivalry, so if you could talk a little bit about that, and then what's your next project?
Yeah, right. So, in some ways, this book came out of The Art of Rivalry, which is divided into 4 chapters where I look at pairs of artists. It's not about rivalry in the sense of, enmity and deep sort of animosity. It's about relationships that were much more intimate and sort of loving in some ways, and where two artists were both susceptible to one another's influence. But in each case, there was a kind of a break, in some cases it was repaired, but there was a kind of falling out. And one of those chapters is on Manet and Degas, and it focuses on the 1860s. So this book, which really focuses on the 1870-71, in my mind is a kind of sequel to that chapter at least. My next project, I don't know. I haven't said anything publicly about it, but I have been thinking a lot about it just in the last few weeks, and I think it's, in some ways, I could think of it almost as the next chapter, but it's going to be about Matisse during the First World War. So again, it's a sort of combination of art and war. But Matisse painted some of his most extraordinary pictures between 1914 and 1918, and his mother was behind enemy lines, and he tried to enlist but couldn't. But yeah, there's a whole story. But I'm hoping that it can be more about the art than I was able to write about in writing about the siege and the commune, where, as I said, just not a lot of art could get made. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking at the moment. Thank you for asking. I don't know how we are for time, Nora. I mean, is that people?
It's 10 to 8.
Yeah, sure.
So could take another question or two, and then
Yeah,
if you wanna.
absolutely. If there are any more questions, yeah, please go ahead.
You mentioned, I think you said that Morrison was one of the most important artists of that century, but then she also was sort of maybe not forgotten, but not really held up in the same way. So has she had influence that's lasted? I mean, were there other artists you think that drew from her, or she had sort of a lasting influence in some way?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, look, I think she was one of the key Impressionist painters, and she was the only woman in that first Impressionist show, and she was in all of the others bar one after she'd given birth to a child. And so just by virtue of that involvement alone, and the fact that they all regarded her, as I said before, as at least their equal, and they all admired her. I mean, that just makes her an incredibly important and influential artist, because Impressionism was the first modern movement. That show was the first sort of moment in the whole history of the modernist avant-garde, and she was in it. So she's important just by virtue of that. But I think it's interesting, just as abstract expressionism in America in the post-war period, just as the sort of high watermark of that moment is relatively brief, because it quickly gets superseded by color-filled painting and pop art and conceptual art and minimalism. Impressionism's time is also relatively brief, because there was a critique that sort of came along quite quickly that had to do with just how sketchy these paintings looked. And there was a sense that, look, this might be interesting and so forth, but it's not going to last. There's no structure in these pictures. There's no, there's no drawing. There's no bones to these pictures. They don't look like proper finished works of art. And we laugh at that as the conservative critique of Impressionism. But in some ways, it was the same critique that the post-Impressionists had. Cézanne, for instance, he really, in his art, he still painted as an Impressionist outdoors, but what he was all about was trying to reintroduce bones into those pictures. He gave them structure with his rhythmic brush strokes and very careful compositions, and these diagonals and the balance of his pictures. He was quite a classicist in that way, and I think similarly Van Gogh paints in a way that is a critique of Impressionism. He wants to use color in a more expressive way, not just a naturalistic way, but a more expressive way. And I think Morisot as well goes into this, Renoir and Pissarro, the other Impressionists, they all also changed their style in different ways, but all in an attempt to kind of answer this criticism of Impressionism, that it's too sketchy, too impermanent. And I think Morisot does the same. And I think it's partly with these very organic lines that suggest almost the rhythms of Art Nouveau, but make me also think of Edvard Munch and the way he divides up his canvas with these incredibly long, sinuous, curving lines. So, yeah, I think that, I think she's been an influence in all those ways, and she liberated color to be much more expressive as well. Yes.
Yeah, I may have my timing not completely accurate, but I'm curious the extent to which you see Impressionism as a reaction, response to the emergence of photography as an art form, in the sense that realistic paintings could never measure up to what the photograph depicted. I'm curious if you see any sort of influence there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're talking about Impressionism and about the beginnings of modernism, photography definitely plays a really big part. And in some ways you can imagine that these painters are saying, okay, this new technology's come along. I better think up something new, because I can't compete with that. There's some truth to it. I think that's a crude sort of way to put it, because of course photography didn't have any color in it for a long time. Also, we tend to think of, a link between modern composition and impressionist compositions and snapshot photography or street photography, the sort of arbitrary cropping and the unusual viewpoints and so forth. But even that didn't become possible in photography until handheld cameras with short shutter speeds came along. When you posed for a photograph, a portrait in the late 19th century, you had to sit very still for maybe a whole minute to avoid blur and so on, because that's how long the shutter was open. And so, but Degas and these other, I think especially Degas, was very interested in photography, and there have been exhibitions and books about the connections between his work and photography, and he experimented with photographs. He took some really interesting photographs himself. So your timing's absolutely right, but I think it's a really rich subject. There's a lot of nuances to it, a lot of complexity, but it's fascinating. I feel like I'm sort of caffeinated or something. I don't usually talk this much. I'm so sorry. But I'm so grateful for it. Should we just take one more? Yeah? Okay. All right.
I love your writing in the Post. I'm so grateful they haven't they've done away with so many fine writing and so many sections.
Lost some great colleagues, haven't we?
It's awful, but so thank God for you. I just wonder if you paint, and what your artistic endeavors are, and if you have anything to say. I know this is a huge question about the modern art scene, because I sometimes feel when I look at something from modern art that I'm one of those fuddy-duddies who doesn't understand this,
I write a lot about contemporary art, and I love it. I actually do. It doesn't mean I love it all, but it's one of the pleasures of being a newspaper critic is that you're engaging with the art of your time. And yet, at the same time, museums are putting on historical shows all the time, and they're very popular, and obviously, I'm engaged with that as well and love it. I don't paint myself like anyone. I've sort of dabbled, I always think of it, I feel insecure about that, because I think that you learn a lot if you're a practicing painter. Just by doing things, you obviously learn about it, and I try to compensate for that by learning as much as I can. I go to artist studios and ask as many questions as I can. Of course, contemporary artists are all working in so many different media. I mean, they might be making video art, they might be making photography, they might be making drawing, painting, it can be anything. Sound art, it can be anything. So, I'm a generalist and a dilettante in so many ways, and that's the pleasure of journalism in a way, isn't it? That we get to just, I might be writing about ancient Greek art one week, and then the latest video art the next week, and everything in between. And for me, that's the pleasure of the job. I really love it. So it's a great privilege, and I'm just so lucky to have the job and to have all these amazing museums and galleries showing amazing work. So I've so far lived a very, very lucky life in that sense. So thank you. Thank you, Nora, so much. I really appreciate it.